This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our supporters at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life by Natasha Leonard. Being Numerous shatters the mainstream consensus on politics and personhood, offering in its place a bracing analysis of a perilous world and how we should live in it. Beginning with an interrogation of what it means to fight fascism, Natasha Leonard explores the limits of individual rights, the criminalization of political dissent, the myths of radical sex, and the ghosts in our lives. At once politically committed and philosophically capacious, Being Numerous is a revaluation of the idea that the personal is political and situates as the central question of our time: how can we live a non-fascist life? Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life by Natasha Leonard, out now from Verso Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm temporarily broadcasting from Santiago de Chile. There is perhaps no more depressing situation in Western Europe than that which prevails in Italy, a coalition government between the far-right Lega party and the now subordinate, bizarre, amorphously anti-corruption, internet-fetishist, pseudo-directly democratic Five-Star movement. In other words, Italian politics is dominated by a viciously racist anti-immigrant politics. The left, along with most traditional forces, is in disarray. Today, Lega, led by Interior Minister Mateo Salvini, runs Italian politics. And after the recent EU elections, they also form part of a sizable bloc of far-right parties in the EU Parliament. But the bad news is also, I guess, the good news. Salvini has not solved Italy's deep-rooted economic problems, and so it's quite possible that the very same instability that abetted his rise will ultimately lead to his downfall. I'm discussing this all today with David Broder, Marta Fana, and also Lorenzo Zamponi. This is the final installment of our 5-part series on European politics that has run over the last 2 weeks. Part 1 was an overview of the situation with Chris Bickerton and Jerome Rose. After that, we had Grace Blakely, Maya Goodfellow, and Richard Seymour on the UK. Then, the French situation with Daniele Bonneau and Sebastian Budgen. And the last episode, before this one, was an interview on Spanish politics with Carlos del Clos and Magda Bandera. Okay, before we get this rolling, this is the part of my introduction where I transcend the fourth wall and ask you to support this podcast that you listen to with a small amount of your money. Your support at patreon.com/thedig is what makes this entire series on European politics, and indeed every episode of The Dig, possible. And it's what makes it possible for us to make it all available for free, unpaywalled, to everyone. Your contributions also built our new website, thedigradio.com, which, as I've mentioned before, has all of our episodes, the entire archives, searchable by guest and by topic. And now we are spending a really big chunk of money on transcribing every new episode and every episode, or maybe almost every episode, in our archive. And we just posted our very first transcript that we finished, my interview with Sam Stein on real estate capitalism. We also, of course, have left-wing books to send you in the mail if you contribute $10 a month or more. But the main reason I'd like you to donate is simply because you should support the left-wing media you consume if you can afford to do so, because we are putting that money to very good use. So, if you can't afford to contribute but haven't done so already, please do so now at patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's David Broder, Lorenzo Zamponi, and Marta Fana. David Broder is the Europe editor for Jacobin, an editor at Jacobin Italia, and a historian of French and Italian communism, currently writing a book on the crisis of Italian democracy in the post-Cold War period. Lorenzo Zamponi is an assistant professor of sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, working on social movements and political participation, and a co-editor of Jacobin Italia. Marta Fana is a researcher in economics, the author of It's Not Work, It's Exploitation, and an editor of Jacobin Italia. David Broder, Lorenzo Zamponi, and Marta Fana, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Across Europe, the far right did well in the recent EU elections, though not as well as many feared. The left did really poorly. In Italy, however, things were somehow even worse than really poor. The far right was overwhelmingly dominant, both Lega and also a smaller party that I hadn't heard of before, Brothers of Italy, and the radical left was really nowhere at all, though the center-left Democratic Party did do somewhat better than expected. What happened in Italy in particular and across Europe in general? Lorenzo.
I think that the success of the Lega in Italy is probably the vanguard, of a right-wing offensive at the European level. I'm not sure that we can find like a transversal tendency to read the whole European election as one same thing, although it's true that some ongoing tendencies, like as the crisis of the mainstream parties, both in conservatives and in center-left terms, is going on. And the people who are somehow getting a profit out of it are far-right parties and liberal democratic parties. I think we're witnessing more or less the Le Pen versus Macron model in France is becoming more or less the rule throughout Europe. We are sadly the vanguard of the nationalist right at this point, and I think it's a very clear example of what we've been seeing also in other countries in which the antagonization of the Democratic Party because of the identification of the center-left with neoliberal policies has opened a huge space for the far right to represent more or less a populist alternative to any kind of neoliberal policy. It's kind of paradoxical, the fact that the League, who is a party who has been in the government in the Berlusconi-led coalitions for decades, who actually implemented neoliberal reforms in Italy, are now the vanguard of anti-austerity, anti-neoliberal political expression. But that's the country which we live at this point,
David, Marta?
I mean, in Europe as a whole, the growth for the far right, I think, has somewhat been exaggerated. I mean, looking at this specific election, I think the real breakthrough of far right parties was actually in 2014. So this time we saw all of the sort of far right, from sort of national conservatives to Eurosceptics and then sort of post-fascist parties across the EU rose from 21 to 23%. So obviously, that's very bad. And certainly, given the weakness of the left, it's evident that the far right is becoming the strongest sort of counter-systemic force. But I think the results for the far right sort of around Europe are quite patchy. If we think like even, say, to take the French case, the Front National, or now it's called Rassemblement National, came first place among all parties, but its vote actually fell slightly. And looking at the Italian case, I think what's interesting is that there's really like no sign of recovery or really anything going on the radical left. But I think there's a certain strangeness of the Italian case, is that although you could say that the Lega versus PD is something like the Macron versus Le Pen situation playing out again in Italy, the particular form that takes is in a way something of a reassertion of the classic center-left, center-right divide of the 1990s and 2000s, in the sense that most of the growth in the Lega's vote comes from the fact that it's eating up the support from other centre-right parties, most notably Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia, the parties with which it stood in alliance before the 2018 general election. And so while it's true that there is something of a Lega vote based on criticism of EU imposed austerity and sort of more generally drawing on a kind of well of resentment and despair caused by Italy's sort of ongoing economic stagnation, I question how much of the far right bloc in Italy is really coming from working class or former left wing voters. At the same time, the tendency towards centre, to more traditional centre left and versus right wing divide is really driven by the collapse of the Five Star movement. In the general election in March 2018, the Five Star movement got 2% and the Lega got 17%. And in the May 2019 European election, after they've been in government together for barely a year, the scores were exactly reversed. And in national opinion polls, we see the Lega, which only has half as many seats as the Five Star movement, now has double the support in the polls. We also saw, there were local elections over the weekend as well. And we're really seeing that Five, which had represented a sort of third block of support in Italian politics, its challenge is fading very rapidly. So while that party in particular incarnated revolt against the old parties, maybe had a more working class and younger electorate, its vote is now fading away, partly in favour of the far right, but also a lot of it's just going to abstention.
Marta?
I agree with both Lorenzo and David on this kind of peculiarity of the Italian vote, in the sense that what have been flow from the Five Star movement to the League Nord, and at the same time this renewal vote for the Democratic Party, is that we actually are not even in this populistic moment. But also, if we look at the absolute value of votes, actually, the Democratic Party is not getting more votes than before, especially if we look at the last European election, but also to the general elections last year. At the same time, what we and face actually is that the difference between this big rhetoric of the League Nord against austerity or the European Commission and what the real content of their policies and proposals are, since historically the League Nord has been one of the pillars of the Berlusconi government so far, and still they are within these neoliberal and pro-austerity and pro-rich economic and social policies.
So what is the current state of the Italian radical left, and why has it been utterly unable to capitalize on both this acute and also long-running economic crises to mobilize people around working class identity as an alternative to the far right's racist, civilizational, nationalist Italian identity?
I think that there are obviously different reasons behind this process. There are some reasons which are internal to the radical left. The fact that basically the Italian radical left were never really able to recover its huge crisis in 2008, when it formed for the first time a united electoral cartel called the Rainbow Left, who got only 3% of the votes, while together the pre-existing parties got more than 10%, and it never were actually able to recover from that, and there are obviously internal distinctions and divisions and rivalries that made it really difficult. Then there is a more institutional reasons, which is the fact that the peculiar electoral system of Italian elections forces parties to be part of electoral coalitions before the campaign starts. So basically, there has been always this element of division between the different leftist parties on whether to ally or not with the Democratic Party. And this has been something which has been an internal cleavage dividing every leftist attempt in the last 10 years, Should we be part of the center-left and aim at governing, or should we form an electoral alternative to that? And then, of course, there are also other more societal reasons. On the one hand, the Five-Star Movement has been an incredibly powerful competitor. Okay, the radical left wasn't able to politicize in a progressive sense anti-austerity mobilization between 2010 and 2012, and in that exact moment, the Five-Star Movement somehow stole the thunder, okay, from the radical left, and was somehow able, at least rhetorically, to embody the idea of an anti-neoliberal alternative. At this point, okay, the result of the European election was not really that unexpected, okay? It's only an extreme occurrence of something we've already been witnessing for around 10 years, okay? The reduction of the Italian radical left to a residual and marginal space, which is still able to play a role from a social point of view, on the squares, in terms of mobilization and cultural point of view, and so on, but is not able to play any significant electoral role. And I think it's very significant the fact that, according to different analyses, many of the traditional voters of the radical left this time directly voted for the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party somehow embodied the opposition to Salvini. Okay, there is some kind of two-part.
That's the French dynamic again.
Yeah, it's basically this idea of the two-party system, which doesn't exist in reality, still exists in the mind of many voters. Okay, and even in elections which are played with a proportional representation system, there is this idea of we should stop the right from winning, and this is something which is an incredibly powerful force. And then, of course, the Five-Star Movement, as David said earlier, is in a big crisis, lost a lot of votes, but still it is a big party. It is a party that is governing and aims to go on governing. And if you are a voter which is in some way progressive but not that politicized, it's still more likely that you then try and find representation in the Five-Star Movement, although in government with a right-wing party, than in the radical left.
Marta, what's your take? And is it fair to say that Five-Star took up the space that a Podemos or La France Insoumise style left populism might have occupied in Italy?
Actually, they did, but with totally different claims and arguments and political campaigns, if we want. So the idea of this movement, or the Five-Star Movement, started, yes, as Podemos against corruption and overall waste or the losing credibility of the political institution and system and whatsoever, but they missed all the social arguments like Podemos or La France Insoumise always push until now, even if the last European election, but also the local elections for Podemos was not so good. At the same time, so I totally agree with Lorenzo when he said, okay, since 2008 and even before, the radical left start splitting each 6 months or a year. But what we have to notice in Italy that we have as the last really big political and social organization is trade union. And trade union still plays a role in Italy. So the problem was that the radical left and trade unions, and mainly the CGL is a specific trade union, the biggest one, actually did not campaign as they could since the start of the crisis or the government of the crisis of this ideal recovery in which the Italian economy is living since 2012. This is a huge problem because you don't have, not doing this, not campaigning on, I don't know, minimum wage, minimum income, social welfare, or stop outsourcing all our welfare system is something that doesn't increase any consensus around topics that really unite the working class part. And today we have half of the working class. So we have half the working class votes, so blue collars, and half of them, so 1 out of 4 white collars actually vote for the League Nord, who says, oh, we don't want to delocalize or offshore firms, but then they do. They let them do something like that. And we have plenty of example on this. At the same time, so the radical left in Italy has another problem since at least a decade. It is the credibility of people in leading these parties. And this is a problem because what we had as a shock, as a political shock in the electoral terms, has been people saying, we don't want these people still government. That it was against the Democratic Party during the last general election, and not for the radical left that was not even almost in the government. And this is the first time we don't have representative at the European Parliament.
David, what's your take? As this discussion about Five Star reminds me of the interview we did last summer in terms of these really revealing problems with anti-corruption politics that are entirely anti-corruption politics, and sort of what sort of politics that adds up to in the end.
Yeah, so anti-corruption politics have a quite long history in Italy, because even at the start of the 1990s, what destroyed the old Christian Democratic and Socialist parties was a corruption scandal, the trials of Tangentopoli, so-called Bribesville affair, which saw more than half of MPs under investigation. And actually, that was really key to the initial rise of the Lega Nord, partly also with its northern chauvinist politics, in the sense of seeing Rome as a hotbed of corruption and giving out money to lazy southerners and so on, whereas Italy needed a modernized but kind of also Thatcherite economic order and state machine. Some of the same ideas were adopted by the Five Star movement and by its guru, Gianroberto Casaleggio, who in fact used to hang out in Lega circles in the 1990s. And what's this anti-corruption politics always had a very kind of technocratic and depoliticizing edge. So as Marta said, Five Star movement never connected anti-corruption or its kind of anti-elitist politics to an alternative sort of vision of like investment or creating jobs or social problems or austerity. It was much more focused on sort of getting rid of ideology and politics and politicians and returning to some imagined sort of normal or apolitical administration. Of course, in alliance with the Lega Nord party with a much stronger identity, a much stronger agenda and indeed leader, the Five Star movement has really crumbled. So in the government together with the Lega, we've seen such things as, for instance, when Salvini himself came under criminal investigation for his role for basically keeping migrants hostage by refusing to allow a ship to dock. Whereas the Five Star movement's initial agenda for cleaning up politics would have demanded that its MPs automatically vote for him to be put on trial. They instead didn't, because they didn't want to split the coalition because they're afraid of there being elections. More recently, there was a different scandal involving a Lega transport minister where the Five Star movement took a harder line. But certainly and also, some of its own officials have come under investigation. So this like anti-corruption or cleaning up politics agenda hasn't really allowed it to maintain a consistent political space.
It's important to, for example, to highlight that the last regional and local election in the south of Italy, especially specifically Sicily, that has always been governed by the right, in which during the last general elections, the Five Star movement got the 52%, right? So first big party there. But 4 months before, still, it was the center-right and the Berlusconi party who won the election, meaning that there was really a crash. And this ideology and idea, and so if you want narrative, according to which Rome is the problem, but still we can make things better, still governing like we are, meaning patronage, clientelism, and even organized crime is okay. And at the same time, the difference in terms of your first question about difference with Podemos, Five Star movement against Podemos, is that the Five Star movement in this sense always plays an interclassist role, in the sense that they asked for the introduction of this strange and not real minimum income system for the South, but in the North, it was always, we have to reduce the tax burden for firms, we have to, firms be free to invest and get rid of all these bureaucratic and administrative burden and whatsoever. So there was a clear interclassist rhetoric that Podemos never had, pushing exactly the anti-corruption movement and question and issues in class terms, meaning that corruption is such thing that reduced investment for social security or social infrastructure and whatsoever. This is an interesting in my point of view, an interesting difference between them.
Why is it that Five Star has so quickly become subordinated to Lega in the coalition government?
Yeah, that's a very interesting case. Also because the Five Star movement are basically a very rare case of pure populism. Usually in the last few years, we have seen left-wing populists, right-wing populists, different kinds of populism. The Five Star movement really tried to embody the pure form of digital populism. The idea that the only...
Like techno-populism.
Exactly. An idea of techno-populism in which mobilizing the common people through the internet against the political elite was the beginning and the end of every political discourse. Okay, obviously this made their discourse very effective and also able to do something that was usually very difficult in Italian politics, which was the idea of attracting votes both from left and right-wing voters. Okay, Italian voters tended traditionally to be rather conservative in the sense of always voting on the same side. The idea of switching left to right and vice versa has always been very rare in Italian politics. The Five Star movement were really the first party who were able, to attract votes in this transversal cross-ideology way. But obviously, when, as David said earlier, when you put them together in a government with a party that has a very clear political identity, a very clear ideology, and not responsibility whatsoever, because the Lega does not have any position or real responsibility in the government, does not hold the minister for the economy, does not hold the foreign minister, Salvini, the leader of the League, is a minister of interior. He uses this position only to go around dressed as a policeman, He's basically cosplaying as a policeman every day. And that's the only way he does as minister for interior. And so the League is really free to act as a 24/7 propaganda machine, while the Five Star movement is occupied trying to govern in a quite inefficient way, because of the lack of preparation and because, of course, of the ideological ambiguity that characterizes them on every possible issue. In this way, the League is really being able to cannibalize every kind of consensus. And obviously, the Five Star movement is also paying a lack of leadership. Luigi Di Maio, the official leader of the Five Star movement, is nothing comparable to Salvini in terms of charisma, in terms of capacity to embody any political symbol, any political struggle, any challenge to everyone. Also, if you do what the Five Star movement have been trying to do for years, as David and Marta said earlier, it was depoliticizing everything, depoliticizing anti-corruption scandals, depoliticizing environmental issues, and so on. You end up really leaving space for the only existing political topic in 2019 Italian politics, which is the immigration, which is the issue that belongs structurally to the League. And in this way, they were really able to open the way for the League. As David said earlier, the League did not increase so much the spectrum of right-wing voters in general, but they were able to attract all the traditional right-wing voters, stealing all the support that used to belong to Berlusconi's own party. It was especially visible in the South, but it's incredible. Now the League is the largest party in Emilia-Romagna, which used to be the reddest region, in Italy, with a very strong communist heritage. Is the second party with more than 33% of the votes in Tuscany and had the traditionally red regions. It was able to conquer many mayors in many different traditionally leftist cities. It's really an increasing movement on the rise. And this is something that, on the one hand, it suggests the idea that Salvini may withdraw his support to the existing government in order to govern on his own. On the other hand, why should he bother? He's already in charge without any kind of responsibility. So the idea of letting the Five Star movement take the blame for everything that actually happens, and at the same time, exploiting the fact of being in the government for this huge propaganda machine, is a very favorable position for them.
David, Marta?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's funny is that the general election was last March, and it was a surprise that the Lega overtook Forza Italia, Berlusconi's party. All of the polls had it slightly behind, but in fact the Lega, for the first time, became the biggest right-wing party nationally. And then you had 3 months of negotiations for the coalition. Then we had the Lega's candidate for the finance minister rebuffed by the president, Sergio Mattarella. And that moment of crisis was basically the moment when the Lega came to dominate the government, because the sense of it being under attack from the European Union and the strong powers in the state and the Christian democratic president and so on. Already by that moment, the Lega was catching up with the Five Star Movement. And already at that point, which is last June, it would have been disastrous for the Five Star Movement to not make the pact with the Lega and to go to the polls again, because the Lega's position was so strengthened. And we've basically seen the whole period since the Lega has been able to blackmail the Five Star Movement, as well, of course, the things that Lorenzo says I agree with very much. It's been very weak. So, for example, like kind of communications or sort of taking credit even for sort of right-wing or anti-immigrant policies. So, for instance, as Interior Minister, when Salvini announced on Twitter the government closing the ports, in order for that to actually happen, he needs a decision to be made by the Transport and Infrastructure Minister, Danilo Toninelli, who's a member of the Five Star Movement. But the way it plays out, it's like the Toninelli, the Five Star guy, he like sort of implements Salvini's decision, but allows Salvini to take credit for it. So it just shows himself to be kind of totally sort of subaltern to his agenda. At the same time, I think what we were talking before about anti-corruption and the former, the Lega Nord's former rhetoric around the corrupt South, and Marta mentioned the clientelism and patronage structures which have so often characterized politics in southern Italy. But what's interesting is now that the Lega is becoming a truly nationwide party. In the general election last year, it stood in every region, and now it's winning support in once left-wing regions, but also in southern regions. The kind of people who are joining its new branches, as it selects candidates, as it creates party sections, they're people who are coming from Berlusconi's party, they're coming from post-fascist groups, but also they're coming from the world of organized crime. There's people who are sort of old, Christian democratic bosses from the 70s and 80s. So you're seeing exactly the political layers that the Lega Nord used to stand against are in fact now becoming its cadres in the southern regions. And that's allowing Salvini's party to create a very strong political force that's dominating the right-wing bloc, but also, of course, represents a certain contradiction within its self-presentation.
A contradiction that is the result of it successfully representing the consolidation of the Italian right.
Yeah. But at the same time, that's not to say that it's entirely abandoned its sort of northern chauvinist soul. It has a proposal. The others will be better able to speak about in detail than I am. But so there's this idea of differentiated autonomy, where they still want to give more tax powers to the northern regions, heartlands of the Lega, like Veneto, the region north of Venice, and the Lombardy, where Milan is. At the same time, they've made some quite curious deals with sort of regionalists, also in regions outside of the north, most notably in Sardinia. So they're actually trying to push more autonomy also from the southern and poorer regions.
Just to clarify briefly, we went over this in our interview last year, David, but for those who don't know, the Lega was the Lega Nord, the Northern League, and their project was a secessionist one premised on northern superiority, economic and even racial, against southern Italy.
What David says is really important, especially on the network of clientelism and patronage in the south. Okay, there is the usual bandwagon effect with these local powers always looking for the strong party to support, the party who has the chances to be in the government for a long time, to be able to provide the resources on which the networks are based, and so on. And obviously, there is the contradiction that David was pointing out between this rhetoric of the differentiated autonomy and the fact that they are actually going for the Southern vote. Although the Lega has always been very good at promising autonomy without ever delivering anything. Okay, we're talking about a party who called for independence, secessions, or federalism and autonomies for 20 years without delivering any single reform in more than 20 years in the government. Okay, and that's what they're trying to do at the same time, keeping alive this idea of regional autonomy, of tax powers, and so on in a rhetorical level, but actually never really thinking about delivering like that. Also, because what they're promising is to allow, especially two regions, as David was saying, Lombardy and Veneto, to keep in the local level 90% of their tax revenues. Now, no country in the world would be able to close any kind of budget with the two richest regions keeping at the local level 90% of the tax revenues. It's virtually impossible, okay? So it's something that they keep alive in order to maintain their local support, okay? But it has no possibility whatsoever to be approved.
Marta, is it fair to say that the coalition with Five Star for Lega has ultimately been a bridge for Lega taking over Five Star's voter base in the South?
Yes and no, in the sense that the weakness of the Five Star movement in governing, so the lack of experience and even political ideas, as we already say, is something that for sure enabled the Lignor to take over. But what really takes this strength, actually gives strength to Lignor, is what Lorenzo was saying, meaning that we have this bourgeoisie bloc in the South that always voted for the Berlusconi party, that need public expenditure and need someone in the government to give them this money. And in fact, something that Salvini is doing for them is not the autonomy and the secessionist laws that are not there, are proposal but not really voted, is to allow for more public budget to go under public procurement without limits, no? In the sense that we don't have to negotiate, but we can go through direct procurement. And for example, subcontracting could increase. This means that for a firm to control the territory and the economic dependency of the territory is higher, right? So there is this exchange, but it's an exchange on the center-right, never-ending economic policy, if you want, in terms of economic spending. And what is real of Lorenzo's argument actually is that in this secessionist and this differentiated autonomy and the welfare state, so how we finance the welfare state, is that in any case, what they are cutting with this kind of differentiated autonomy is exactly the welfare state. Because in terms of revenue from corporate firms and in general businesses, the taxes has already been reduced. So it's a matter of fact that going against the working class. So in this sense, the League Nord is still playing this strong neoliberal and conservative politics.
I want to talk more about migration, which is obviously, as we've alluded to multiple times, is at the center of what's going on in Italian politics right now, because a certain determinism often takes hold in discussions about anti-immigrant politics. We heard that from Hillary Clinton, I think, last year, as if there's like a natural, almost hydrological law at work whereby the mere existence of migrants automatically provokes xenophobia. But this, of course, is not the whole story. There's always political and economic context. So my question is, how is it that anti-migrant politics have emerged, developed as not so much but the dominant political force in Italy?
I think that there is no direct link between the presence of migrants and the politicization of immigration. This has been analyzed through loads of studies, and even you see it even in the electoral results. Okay, the League got hundreds of thousands of votes in areas of the country in which there are virtually no immigrants, okay? In villages in the middle of the countryside, in areas of the south, in Sardinia, which has basically no immigrants, okay, but only emigrants, only people who leave from it to go in the rest of the country and outside. There has been a great propaganda effort in the media to try and portray migrants as the big enemy. And I think that this has really much to do, on the one hand, with what we were discussing earlier, the failure of the left to politicize the crisis in order to make the economic elite into the real political enemy, and then the following failure of the Five-Star Movement, who identified the political elite in the political enemy. Okay, and I think that the final narrative of the Northern League, and now the League, which is the idea that migrants are the enemy, and not simply migrants. Okay, migrants with this whole conspiracy theories of the NGOs working together with Soros and the EU in order to ethnically substitute Italians and transform our DNA in something different, and so on and so forth. Okay,
the great replacement.
Exactly, the clergy plan, the great replacement, all these weird conspiracy theories are something that provided a recognizable narrative. Okay, and a lot of people in times of economic hardship and social disintegration need to know what's going on, and there is a factor that we don't take into account many times, and it's the fact that Silvio Berlusconi still owns half the national TV channels in Italy. We've been obsessing about that man for 20 years. Now he's not been in power for 5 years, and it seems like we've forgotten he ever existed. But he's still there, okay? And during the last electoral campaign, when he still thought, as David said earlier, that the League was a minor ally of his coalition, he used massively TV in order to build this anti-immigration frenzy, okay? And now, of course, it's playing against him. And as David said earlier, the League has become the big actor on the right. But Berlusconi's TV had a huge role in that. And a huge role in that was also played by the center-left. The Democratic Party never had the capacity to develop a firm stance on immigration. It went back and forth between a humanitarian, cosmopolitic attitude that we should be welcoming, okay, and the attempt to play the law and order card, the tough on immigration card, and compete with the League on immigration, never really challenging, okay, the core of the Salvini's argument. And this is what was mobilized. And there is no correlation between the presence of migrants and the increase of the far right. And this is very clear because still Italy is not the European country which is most severely involved in immigration. Sure, it is a country of first arrival for many people, but most of these people are aiming to go somewhere else, okay? They didn't leave their home countries in order to get into a country with huge levels of unemployment, obviously. Then, of course, also the EU is to blame. The European Union policies have been incredibly unfair and controversial in the handling of immigration, especially the Dublin Treaty, which requires asylum seekers to stay in the country in which they were firstly identified, creating huge problems also because most of the people do not have the goal to stay in Italy. They want to go away, but at the same time, of course, they helped create this huge conspiratory narrative that the EU is sending all these migrants here in order to invade us, okay? And I'm not saying that the majority of Italians believe this shit, obviously, okay? But there is a clear, understandable narrative that somehow it's easy to have everything to fit in, okay? It's an explanation of the bad situation in which we're living.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's interesting that you note that it's also places with a lot of emigration rather than just places with immigrants where xenophobia has really taken root, because that's something I've thought about in the U.S., where there's a lot of xenophobia, including in places where there are not really that many immigrants. And it's also true in places like Hungary, where no migrants really want to go to at all. But a lot of Hungarians are leaving Hungary. A lot of Polish people are leaving Poland. And I think it really gets at this profound fear about the future, the possibility of efficacious social reproduction into the future that xenophobia really taps into, and that doesn't necessarily even require the actual presence of migrants.
Exactly. There is this big fear of what's going on. Okay, we are in times of tremendous change. Okay, automation, technological innovation, globalization. There is this scary idea of this brave new world. And in this, okay, if you are able to find the right enemy to blame, the black man, okay, which is coming to invade us and take our place, okay, it's something that can really trigger very aggressive responses.
Marta?
Just follow up on that, and I totally agree with Lorenzo's argument, but more if we take what the message from the TV was on for more than 1 year, because Salvini have been on TV during the last 6 years every day in more than one TV show. This actually makes that difference, and in this sense, one of the arguments in order to understand why in highly unemployed cities with no migrants at all, people are saying, okay, but why we have to pay 35 euros per day to these guys that arrives actually, and not in welfare state? So this was the claim. And of course, so the left never counteract on this argument doing something, because we are in a kind of austerity-led economic policy since 2 decades, not just since the crisis, but since the crisis. Obviously, this has been more acute and more aggressive.
But Italy has a long-running crisis, you're saying, which I think is important to emphasize, that predates 2008.
Yes, exactly. And actually, what we see from the economic statistics and etc., labor market and inequality, this crisis, as a huge crisis, started in 92. That is the same year we had this Mani Pulite corruption, a huge political scandal David was mentioning. And it is exactly the year in which we had the last aggressive economic crisis with the lira devaluation, and all the austerity programs started there in magnitude. Okay, so in terms of wages and welfare and whatsoever. So now, after the second huge crisis being in 2008, people say, okay, so our savings are not enough to give our kids university and etc., because we have a welfare system that is really poor compared to the European average. At the same time, there is all this rhetoric against migrants and exactly what the Kalergi plan and whatsoever, that is quite strange. But it's at the same time, if we go into the policies that have been voted and passed, is the center left during the last government, so the Renzi and Gentiloni government, that passed the laws against migrants in Italy, and also the government of this kind of rhetoric crisis was there, implemented as urgency, day by day emergence against migrants.
David?
We were talking before about the fact that it's not necessarily the areas where migrants are coming that are the ones where this anti-migrant politics is on the rise. And indeed, in general, it's true that even before the current government came into power, the number of migrants arriving in Italy had drastically reduced. The previous centre-left government, and particularly its Interior Minister Mateo Salvini, boasted of having reduced the number of arrivals by 87%. But of course, in so doing, that doesn't sort of appease the anti-migrant politics, but just feeds it by continually proposing this as like the central aim and objective of the government, and as the issue that most needs dealing with, as well as the kind of law and order, this continual fear-mongering about migrants causing crime and rape and so on that Lorenzo mentioned. Of course, I think the other reason why migration politics are so central also has to do with what Marta said about the length of the crisis, and the fact that since the early 1990s, Italy has had dramatically less growth than its neighbours, and never really breaking out of much more than stagnation. Because even in the 1990s and 2000s, politics was very polarized around the figure of Berlusconi personally, the bringing of post-fascists back into government, and these kind of identitarian issues coming to the foreground, as opposed to alternative plans for social and economic change. And I think that's also part of the reason why Italy has 5-star and not Podemos. Like, partly it is to do with the the fact that the radical left collapsed at the moment of the 2008 crisis, which was exactly the years in which the Five Star movement was first emerging. So therefore, Five Star kind of exploited a window of opportunity. But I think it also draws on a kind of deeper sort of sense of despair and a deeper sense of belief that the state can't do anything, that political action or sort of big projects aren't going to do anything to help people. So it's like the political debate just generally isn't really focused on, or well focused on, questions of economic recovery and the kind of practical steps that might be made.
There's a certain cynicism that's conducive to the xenophobia and Euroscepticism that's not at all conducive to a left proposal to transform society and government.
Yeah, for sure. Because if you look at it's often said that the Five Star movement is strong among younger voters. That was particularly true in its earlier phase and was less true in the recent general election. But actually, also, I think it's worth noting that the strongest vote for the Five Star movement when it was at its peak wasn't among the youngest voters, but among people in their 40s. And I think part of the problem also from the kind of perspective of, how does the radical left politicize the crisis, or how do you start to build the basis of resistance to austerity, is you have an ever greater section of the population who are like people who are in their 30s or 40s, who live with their parents, who've had long periods of unemployment or perhaps even never had a job. And it's very hard with that kind of, it's hard to give people who've been through that kind of experience, it's hard to build the bases of solidarity or to offer realistic solutions. So I think that's why the Five Star movement's promise of a universal income, although Marta, I totally agree with what she said, it's a false promise, it's very empty, it's a small amount of money, and it's something more like payment for seeking work. But I think the reason that the proposal had some cut through is that it was able to appeal to, it was able to offer something kind of concrete, material, and therefore I think a certain part of the Five Star movement's electorate was appealed to by that. Whereas with the same kind of voters, I think it would be harder to mobilize for a left-wing party because it would be harder to give them the real belief that, that collective action, solidarity, labor movement were going to do something for them, literally just because they haven't got the experience of seeing it actually happen.
Lorenzo, Lega, of course, is both Eurosceptical and stridently, racistly anti-migrant, as we've mentioned just a few minutes ago. Is it this notion of establishment elites being treasonous to the Italian people, working on behalf of outsiders, whether in Brussels or from Africa? Is that what binds the two things together, the Euroscepticism and the xenophobia?
Definitely. Although the argument, the issue of Europe has been addressed in a very confusing way by all Italian parties. Nobody's really sure what the Lega stands for regarding the EU. They called for leaving the EU a few years ago, then they said we will never leave. Now they campaign for let's change euros from within. The same really regards the Five Star movement. They wanted to organize a referendum to abandon the euro as a common currency a few years ago, while now they're saying, no, we want to get into the European Parliament in order to change it from within, and so on and so forth, okay? They are more or less having the same attitude towards the EU that every Italian government had previously, the Democratic Party, but even Berlusconi before. The idea of we'll go to Brussels and we'll stamp our fist on the table and we will be able to negotiate on national interest, okay? Really ignoring the need for dramatic, fundamental change in the European integration process. It's true that there is this anti-establishment idea, the idea of the treasonous elite, which is trying to somehow keep together racism, xenophobia, and Euroscepticism. And even beyond that, okay, there is the attempt to somehow resurrect Italian nationalism. Okay, Italian nationalism has been hidden, buried for decades. Anti-fascist consensus after World War II basically was forbidding everyone, okay, to raise any issue that had never anything to do with a case of nationalism. Berlusconi actually tried to resurrect it, the massive use of the national flag, the acceptance of former fascist party in the coalition and so on. And Salvini is actually betting on this, on the fact that actually you can be a nationalist in Italy, and if you are able to do it, it's pretty effective. This idea that Italians are somehow vaccinated, immune to nationalism because of what has been happening after fascism in the last few decades is definitely not true. Italians are...
I'm certainly not getting that impression.
Italians are as attracted to nationalist rhetoric as any other country in the world, okay? And it's working. It's working.
Marta, what's your take on Lega's approach to Europe? And is this shift from, flirting with getting out of Europe to fighting within it, is it in part due to Salvini needing the EU as a punching bag for domestic purposes, like what happened with last year's standoff over the Italian budget?
Yes, in a sense, actually, it's pure rhetoric in the sense, exactly. They said, no, we want to exit the Eurozone and we want to follow the European Commission and we have to protect against. So the main point here, as for migrants, is this external threat, right? Always there. And so we can do by ourselves if we stop these enemies from above somehow. But then if you look, all answers to the European Commission recommendation and whatsoever is something that is purely in line with what the European Commission asked as a recommendation for Italy. That is more labor flexibility, less welfare, and something like that. So this is not changed between the Berlusconi government, the democratic government, and now this League North 5-star movement government, which means that now, so for example, the last take has been, we want to issue these small mini bonds in order to pay, so the credit actually that firms have against the public administration, but in the end, it's just to turn a commercial debt into a pure public debt. But at the same time, the real political standpoint and what is the main measure that the League North promises and try to get past actually is the flat tax. That is something against which the European Commission never said a word. So if you look at it, it's really like a cabaret. It's a play and a game they are still making without any structural change, even in the rhetoric and practice.
David?
I'm rather skeptical of the willingness of the Lega to take Italy out of the euro. Particularly when we consider, that would effectively mean default. I mean, notwithstanding the glue that nationalism provides and so on, I don't think its voters want to see their savings destroyed by default. I think the clash with Brussels over the budget deficit limit last year was instructive of the government's weakness and of the Lega's own weakness and the mainly symbolic character of its clashes with the European Union. In that sense, I think it's also interesting to think about, even though Salvini is obviously a very strong leader and the Lega has radicalized over recent years, it's interesting to look at the Lega's past record in government. You mentioned earlier, it used to be for the independence of Northern Italy, but at the same time as being in the government in Rome as a junior coalition partner to Berlusconi. And it constantly did the same thing, which is to be the opposition within the government. So demanding more money for its own regions, saying that it's being sold out and so on, while also actually trying to set the agenda of the government in Rome. So there's a lot of theatre, but the actual moment of confrontation never seems to come. I think the problem also with the mini-bots issue that Marta mentioned, much as with the attempts to appoint a pro-Euro exit, is that it's precisely that making preparation which would allow Italy to leave the Euro would provoke all sorts of disastrous economic consequences immediately. So what's kind of difficult is in judging its behavior and whether the Lega is looking to take it out of the euro, is that if it really was trying to do it, we wouldn't see much evidence that it was trying to. It would be trying to keep quiet about its plans. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm not convinced that its base is really looking for a jump into the abyss outside of the eurozone. I think it's much more a matter of seeking a kind of symbolic clash, which sort of revives a bit of Italian nationalism. But I think it's somewhat inconsequential at the level of its engagement with the EU. It should also be said that although Salvini has indeed talked about entering the European Parliament to change Europe from within, his bloc enjoyed a victory in the European elections, but it still represents only about 10% of all of the MEPs. It's a bit like the Greens saying you want to go into Europe and change things from within. Like, he certainly has a power of disruption, an ability to try and change the discourse, set the tone on issues like migration, but there's not really any prospect of him being integrated into the kind of governance structures. The pro-European centre-right don't really have any interest in deals with him. So I think there's a lot more noise than real effect.
Salvini, of course, has not resolved the underlying contradictions that facilitated his and Lega's rise to power in the first place. And so my last question is, first, what will the trajectory, or what might the trajectory of Italian political economy look like under this government? And second, given that trajectory given that the contradictions have not been resolved, will likely be pretty rocky and not lead to any actual amelioration of people's, pretty shitty material conditions of existence in Italy. Does that hold out any hope for far-right failure and for a reemergence of the Italian left?
Well, obviously, we are still in times of transitions, and the idea of imagining any stable political landscape in Italy and in Europe in general, while the structure of the European economy is still what it is, with austerity policies and all the things that we know of the EU apparatus, it's kind of impossible to imagine. Okay, in the last 5 years, we've seen the very quick rise and then fall of a series of political leaders in Italy. In the last European election in 2014, the Democratic Party of Matteo Renzi got more than 40% of the votes and then collapsed. Last year, Di Maio and the Five Star Movement in the national election got more than 30% of the votes and collapsed. So I'm not really sure that Salvini is better suited than these others to last long. There are structural issues that make it very difficult to govern for anyone, in the Italian government at this point. Italy needs massive Keynesian policies in order to have any possibility to recover from the crisis, and these Keynesian policies are systematically denied by the European Commissions and by other European governments. And there is still room to do something. I'm not saying that there isn't room to do anything. A different progressive government, even inside these very strict limits, could put in place some redistributive policies and so on, sure. But still, the idea of having a massive impact on the economy, it's very difficult to make concrete. It is true, though, that Salvini is not as completely unprepared as Di Maio and Renzi. He's more solid in ideological terms. He can rely on something which is stronger than digital populism or weak liberalism, which is nationalism, which is something that has stronger roots in society. So he will probably last longer than the others, although I really don't see any space for stabilization, for normalization. There is a tendency now to say we're going back towards a traditional center-left, center-right politics, but it's not the case yet. We are going in that direction, but still I don't see anything stable. I see Salvini as subject to the turmoils of the current crisis as any other, although he's more prepared than Di Maio and Renzi were. And I still see space for significant social opposition to him. His political opposition is very weak, but as Marta said earlier, the only thing that still exists in Italy, in Italian society, that has capacity to mobilize is the trade union system. And I think the only hope we have is really in a renewed wave of popular mobilization, which is able to threaten Salvini's support in the lower strata of society.
Marta?
This is so there is hope, obviously, also because during the last 10 days, we hadn't a huge social campaign against austerity. And this is something that in political terms could be capitalized, also because we are more than 10 years after the big crisis, right? At the same time, I agree on the fact that we are still in a transition, and using this everyday 24 hours out of 7 days rhetoric and propaganda helps Salvini being there. But in terms of the political economy of Italy, what I think was going on since now, so since 20 years ago until now, and even tomorrow morning, is this on one hand austerity in terms of social right, welfare system, and etc. And on the other hand, all these pro-corporate and businesses policies, which means, as I said, public procurement, which means intervention by the state in favor of firms, but at the same time cut on taxes, on corporate profits, something that we already had during the last 10 years, but that still Salvini is proposing in a more acute way with this flat tax, for example. So in economic terms, we won't have a recovery, although because in Keynesian terms, it's not just public expenditure as such, but we don't still have any industrial policy in place, nor in ideal terms. So I think that this could be something that can push a huge mobilization, social mobilization through trade unions, but also all what is left. But at the same time, I think that Salvini got another card to play, actually. That is, if he breaks this government, he knows that today he can govern with the center-right. So once more with Berlusconi and the other far-right party. So maybe he knows that in any case, this right coalition can still lead the country. But at the same time, there is hope for an opposition. It is true that if the opposition is what we have seen during the last 20 years against Berlusconi, this personalization of the opposition, we can break the hope just now, right now.
Because if it's just the opposition to Salvini as a bad person, sort of like certain variants of liberal opposition to Trump, rather than something that indicts the very system that produced Salvini, there's little hope there. Exactly.
Also because of, for example, just a tiny example. Okay, he's been persecuted because of these 49 million euros he took and stole actually from public finances. So people start charging him and insulting him because of this. While in the same time, what we can see in the budget law is that he actually take 10 billion from the welfare state and in general public expenditure that have been moved toward firms and not in education, health, etc. So social policies against these corporate policies. So this social and political standpoint is not there and should be.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think the recent changes in party structure, the years of volatility we've seen, which Lorenzo mentioned, mean that we can't really predict that the Lega are going to last forever. Certainly, the fact that they seem to have outcompeted their rivals on the right does seem to put them in a strong position. But at the same time, there is opposition. I think it's unfortunate in a way that the Democratic Party has shown signs of life and will probably be able to channel a lot of the opposition towards itself. particularly if the debate or the rivalry between centre-left and the hard right remains on the level of politics of identity, Europeanism, nationalism, and even immigration, notwithstanding the Democrats' own record on immigration, they will try and use the humanitarian sympathy with migrants to galvanize their own support, much as, for instance, Hillary Clinton might have done against Donald Trump. So, in fact, we've even seen recently some figures who had left the Democratic Party in the previous electoral cycle to the left to try and create something new are now coming back into it under its leader, Nicola Zingaretti, who doubtless represents something of a shift to the left as compared to Matteo Renzi, although not very much. He's a bit like for British listeners, he's a bit like Ed Miliband compared to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. There's a sort of rhetorical recognition that the party was too business aligned and that now it needs to listen to people on low incomes. But overall, the party remains defined by liberal Europeanism against the far right.
David Broder, Lorenzo Zamponi, and Marta Fana, thank you all very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
David Broder is the Europe editor for Jacobin, an editor at Jacobin Italia, and a historian of French and Italian communism, currently writing a book on the crisis of Italian democracy in the post-Cold War period. Lorenzo Zamponi is an assistant professor of sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, working on social movements and political participation, and a co-editor of Jacobin Italia. Marta Fana is a researcher in economics, the author of It's Not Work, It's Exploitation, and an editor of Jacobin Italia. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that all forms of the state have democracy for their truth, and for that reason are false to the extent that they are not democracy. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Julia Rock. Our managing editor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes or wherever, please also take a moment to leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. What also does that is you telling your friends, family, strangers about the show. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us on patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is a huge help.